This is a very different type of presentation because typically throughout the week we've been addressing technology considerations, a lot of commercial considerations, and even operational ones. But we really haven't been thinking about the organizational impact of this whole open networking movement, which is much broader, I would argue broader than automation. It really has to do more with how we're going to address things from the people considerations. So, and don't worry, this is pretty short, so I'm not going to take up a lot of time. So what I want to do is talk about some selected themes. The software-driven and software-oriented R&D team, data-driven decision-making, embracing open source. Open source has been a big topic. We had the harmonization panel discussion just a little bit earlier, and we've been talking a lot about it. And it has all sorts of implications. And then also management. How does management get affected by open networking? And then finally, I just want to tie things together with a few closing thoughts that relate to how we might see this unfold in a real-world organization. So first, I want to start with a definition, a working definition of culture. What are we talking about? This is a term that gets kicked around quite a bit, so I had to do a little research to figure out what kind of definition would be most appropriate for us. And I really like a model that came up that had to do with values, beliefs, and most importantly, priorities. And when we talk about priorities, priorities have nothing to do with ordering and everything to do with action. So in other words, the fact that you make a list and say my top priority is 1, 2, 3, whatever, and then you go and do something else, that's the actual priority. That's what we're talking about. It's about action. So what are some of the implications? Well, culture is manifested by actions. So in other words, the culture is going to determine what actions an organization is going to take. It's going to drive behavior not only at the individual level, but at the organizational level as well. Culture frequently motivates and demotivates people in the organization. This is one of the main reasons why when you're trying to build out a team or you're building out a company, if it's a startup or building out even a larger organization, the cultural fit is such an important consideration in hiring and staffing. And ultimately, culture shapes organizations. Organizations are built around culture. And when we think about how it applies to our own lives, just look around the teams that you're in and the companies that you're at, or even the groups that you're in. You'll start to see some of the indications for that. Now, another area where open networking has had pretty dramatic implications is the software-driven R&D model. And this is, on the right-hand side of this slide, is just sort of a history of software methodologies, starting with our favorite, waterfall, which is in use today in many organizations. Then we evolved into Agile. Agile is much more nimble. It allows us to break things down into smaller pieces and be able to evolve. We then started to think about how DevOps might be implemented in an organization, certainly from an open networking point of view. And now we're talking about automation, and soon it'll be intelligent automation, and then things go on and on. But the implications of this from a cultural and a people standpoint are that the software-oriented organizations have to think about continuous innovation. It's a much more fluid and dynamic or at least environment for developing software. Continuous integration, there's a lot more change. In the hardware world, we didn't change things very often, or at least unless we had to. We didn't upgrade embedded firmware, we didn't upgrade software. We waited years in many cases. I mean, I've worked for some of the largest vendors at least, and I know we had a tremendous time trying to end of life any of our software releases, especially the embedded ones. This is going to have to change in the open networking revolution. We're going to have continuing talent development. We've talked about it a lot this week. The roles that we have, the job functions, the job descriptions, and the organizations are not going to be sufficient in the software world. This is what's going on at many of the major operators in the world. And it has all sorts of implications, everything from legal and regulatory all the way down to the individual training needs that need to be in place. And then also we have to be thinking about adapting the testing methodology and the validation methodology to be able to address the software world. And this was the topic of the other presentation I made a little bit earlier that talked about a more integrated methodology for doing this. Next is decision making. I mean, we need to think about how we're going to look ahead and use a lot more data that's available in this new open networking environment. But we have to we have to do what we've done in network management. It's not just about data collection, it's about the analysis. Well, we're seeing this already, and analytics is providing all sorts of information. But if we don't know how to use it and apply it, it's going to be problematic to be able to maintain that. It's about big business intelligence. Ultimately, it's about the applications that we're going to apply to that big data capability that we're able to expose. And this is not just in the open source community, but with proprietary platforms as well. It's about consolidation. And this is really the key. We're going to have to be able to take huge amounts of information and boil it down towards a business need. That's the implications of what we're working towards in the automated environment. And then, by the way, did I mention that data is important in making these decisions? And if you look at this survey, this came out of Forbes Insights from a report about how data is interlinked with the enhancing the customer experience. Now, the number one factor for benefiting from data analysis and analytics is going to be making decisions faster. And this is exactly what we're trying to do with the open networking movement. It's all about enabling agility. And then let's talk about open source. We've had a lot of discussion on it. Open source is one of those areas that it's hard to get a grasp on, even what it is. But I'm just going to make some simple points based on the experiences I've had, at least over the last number of years, since the early days of open source networking, which is back in 2011-12 timeframe. First of all, open source is the entry point, not the exit point. Or in other words, open source is not intended to deliver a product that's packaged up and can be implemented as a open source distribution. We're going to need to be able to work with other organizations to be able to wrap around additional value, integrate that into a broader environment, and then provide some level of services in order to be able to gain any benefit out of open source. Because open source at the fundamental level, you can think of it as a distribution model. It's a way to get software from the benefit is obviously taking advantage of the many to be able to focus that software into whatever application it's being designed for. So for instance, if you have an SDN controller and you're using Open Daylight, the first open source networking project, it's not going to be very useful if you can't actually integrate with the devices that are going to be sitting in your network. Maybe a really nice model, but it's certainly not going to be very useful until you can integrate it and until you can provide the kind of functionality and intelligence that's consistent with the rest of your overall architecture. One of the key aspects of open source we call upstream first. This is the mantra. And what does this mean? I think a lot of organizations are very, very motivated to take from the open source community, but it's really important that you have to give back to the community. Or in other words, you take a distribution, you make one change, and you know what you have? Open source has just been converted into the proprietary domain. So you have to have a strategy to be able to upstream or return any of those changes back to the code base so that everybody else can benefit. And you can get realize the advantages of collaborative innovation. So this is really key. Another one is that it may not be, open source, as we learned in Daniel's presentation and we heard all week, may not be the answer all the time. Maybe what we really need is a standardized API or another standard reference model. Or maybe we do need open source, but it's not always the answer. It's not the ground zero for anything that we do. And open source is all about enabling and emphasizing value creation. It's about taking code that doesn't offer a lot of value and being able to build on top of that so that you can actually tailor and benefit and capitalize on those open source platforms and components that are going to be integrated in the network. So in other words, open source in itself, if it had a lot of value, there wouldn't be incentives for anybody to contribute that value and just give it away. It's really about getting organizations together when it makes sense to have a piece of code that's much more common and everyone can benefit for. The best example on the planet, of course, is Linux. Would we want to develop our own operating system for every different application? I don't think so. So we need to have that common platform. And of course, in networking, we'll have really the same thing. And then finally, the other area of open source, it's really about collaboration. That's the model. That's the idea. It's not about trying to play some of the games that we all like to play in the industry communities where each organization is trying to get one leg up on the other. In a purest sense, what we're really trying to do is, even though they're competitors sitting around the table, is to focus in areas that we don't have to compete in so that we can actually compete in a more efficient way for those who are going to be using the code as opposed to those producing it. And this is an extraction from a survey that was done on the right-hand side. It's called The Impact of Open Source Technologies on the CSP Ecosystem. It's done by ACG Research, and it was completed in 2018. And this is just to give you an idea of what the surveyed service providers, probably, I'm not sure if Telefonica and who in the room was a part of that survey, what they're looking for from open source. First, unify multiple service providers around a common approach. This is the basis. Next, avoid vendor lock-in. Does this sound familiar? Next, access a broader talent pool than you would on your own or that any one vendor could. And then finally, to achieve better ROI on the development assets. This is what we're hearing all week in terms of the road to automation. And then finally, we have to be able to think about how management is going to be affected, how organizational management's affected. And first of all, we like to think, I come from Silicon Valley, and I know Dan and some people in this room are also living in the Bay Area. And it's a very different kind of environment because we're surrounded by startups and surrounded by the cloud operators and some of the leading technology providers. I live in Mountain View, which is right between Apple, Google, and Facebook. I mean, you couldn't get more barricaded in with those kind of companies. But in the end, what we have to start thinking about in terms of management is not just, oh, we want a startup, let's just go in and reinvent the wheel and just think about things differently. No, we want to complement the experience of the organization with new blood and new ideas. We also want to be able to incentivize the right kind of behavior. Human beings and organizations are very sensitive to incentives. I mean, if someone told you that you're going to get double your bonus by going in and inventing, for each line of code you provide, what do you think that's going to do to the code repository? You're going to have 10 times as much code as you would have had otherwise. Is that a good thing? I don't know, but you'd get your bonus. That is the way organizations and people operate. And then finally, we need to reward risk-taking, initiative, innovation, and failure, meaning you got to try. It's not enough to think. It's not enough to talk about it. You got to do something. And if it doesn't always work, it's about taking those lessons learned and applying it the next time. And then finally, this is one that I've been thinking about for a long time. In looking at team building, you really need to look at hiring a psychologist. And what I mean is that there is so much research now about how teams can be more effective. And these three references at the bottom about, one of them is how the world sees you. This is a model that a very clever individual came up with based on working with some of the largest companies in the world about how the communication style and the way you come across and your skills are perceived by those around you, and how by putting those different styles together, you can get much more effective team building. Please understand me as the opposite. If anybody in this room taking the Myers-Briggs profile for personality, temperament, I don't know if you're familiar with this. This is like a 50-year-old survey that breaks everybody in the world down into 16 different temperaments. And the idea here is to be able to look at those temperaments and put them together in different ways. And by the looks on your faces, some of you are very puzzled. This is why you need to look into this. And then emotional intelligence is the latest buzzword in this area. But this is a survey that you administer to your teams to extract different dynamics that can be picked and chosen in different ways to create more effective team building, more effective collaboration within those teams, and more focused teams to be able to address the organizations, or the objectives of the organization. So I'd encourage you to look at all of those resources. So finally, we're there, the last slide of the event. Let's talk about the open-oriented organization. I mean, clearly, we need to think in terms of building new core competencies that leverage the experience base in the organization. It's not start from scratch. It's not go and apply Facebook's model into whatever's organization, whether you're a vendor, whether you're an operator, whether you're a system integrator or a solution provider or whatever you are. It's about being able to leverage the core competencies your organization had with these new skills. It's also be able to blend the experience with these new ideas that we've been talking about. Automation has huge implications. And I know from dealing with some organizations, this is a great fear because automation is perceived as lose jobs, gut organizations, and so forth. So we have to be able to think about how we're going to address that, get the positives, and minimize the negatives. We need to innovate new roles. The titles that exist, go do a search on LinkedIn in the career section, and you will not believe all of these new titles that we never heard of before. We have the Chief Engagement Officer, the Chief Experience Officer. We have a whole range of different titles that we never even had before. And the one career track that I've noticed a huge amount of interest in is the open source career track. We have an open source office, and open source officers, and open source evangelists, and open source and open source adopters. It's a really interesting change that's happening in this area. Now, that being said, it's not about changing the world. It's about moving deliberately. It's about moving gradually. This is not going to happen overnight. Even if the organization believes it can happen overnight or tries to force it, people resist change. I took a change management seminar many years ago, and the first slide said, change is a threat and change is an opportunity. Which do you want it to be? And of course, then we had a survey, and about 3/4 of the people in the room thought, based on the survey results, change is definitely a threat, even though their mouths was saying change was such a great opportunity. So we got to be really cautious in trying to implement these new ideas for creating the open-oriented organization. And then finally, we just need to continue down the path. We have to stay the course. This is not going to happen overnight. And the fact that the cloud scale the hyperscale operators that are always in the background are breathing down everyone's neck, that doesn't mean that we can still move any faster than we can move. And that's going to depend a lot on the organization. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being open to this talk. I also want to thank everyone for coming to the conference. I think that we're now at the point of winding down. Dan, did you have any closing remarks? I think you were going to say a few things. And everyone have a great, safe trip home, whether you're driving across town or whether you're flying back to California like some of us are. So thank you very much.